Um, so last time we tried to define capitalism, and I explained that capitalism is one mode of production, but that historically, over the long term, there have been four modes of production. There has been hunting and gathering, there has been slavery, there has been feudalism with a tributary mode, and there has been capitalism. And then I talked a little bit about um, sort of explaining things. Why do things happen? And you cannot explain things completely by sort of economic causes. Uh, Economics is very important, extremely important, but it's inflected by culture, as I tried to explain. Now, having said that, before we broke off, I talked about how um, out of the feudal mode and out of the slave mode, especially in the ancient world, Greece and Rome, civilization emerged. Civilization is an attribute of the slave and the tributary mode, and subsequently, of course, capitalism. We do not consider hunting and gathering society to be part of civilization. I will have more to say about that in a few minutes. Now, at the end of the class, I began to talk about the attributes of capitalism, and I explained to you that this is the first review question, so it's very important to reference this. It's being recorded on YouTube as I speak, and of course, last lecture is on YouTube. And I should note that the key words for this lecture are also on YouTube, as well as further illustrations and maps. In any case, we're talking about the attributes of civilization. So the first point I made was that civilizations involve cities, towns. The word civilization comes from the Roman word civitas or civilis, and so the first attribute that you note in your recording is the existence of cities and towns. Now, the people who live in cities and towns, they're busy with all sorts of things. They're busy with government. They're busy making things or buying and selling things and so on. They don't grow their own food. And therefore, foundational to cities, there has to be agriculture. So the second attribute of civilization are agricultural surpluses. The people who live in the countryside, overwhelmingly peasants, are the people who produce this surplus. And so you have cities, their population involved in trade and manufacture, government, and you have agriculture as the basis of city life. A third attribute of civilization is the existence of states and state religion. States and state religion. That is to say, located in the cities, but extending its influence out in the country, is the creation of a political state which administers the society. So we have cities, we have agriculture, and on top of that, we have a state structure radiating out from the cities. And as part of that state structure is the state religion. Now, the political structure is composed in these civilizations that we're talking about. There's a king or an emperor or what have you, a ruler, invariably. But he is supported by some sort of bureaucratic apparatus. So there's a bureaucracy, the people who keep the records and collect the taxes, or run the courts, those sorts of people. Then in order to enforce or to police the society and ensure people pay taxes and so on, and don't kill one another, there is a police force and an army. A police force and army is necessary. So you have those two essential elements of a state, but the third element is the state religion. The priests in all of the civilizations that we're looking at, China is a bit exceptional, but in all of the civilizations we're looking at, the priests who are closely tied to the state, they carry out essential functions. There are two functions that the priests have, and they continue to have right down to the present. And that is, first of all, they are intermediaries between the population and the divine order. In all of these civilizations, there's some sort of concept of a divine order, and it is the priests that are the intermediaries between the people and the divine order, which is understood to sort of control what is happening in the society, and also which is happening in nature, because the second function is the priests pray for rain, or the priests pray for a good harvest, and so on. In other words, they are intermediaries with nature itself. They ensure that nature smiles on the population. And so, but the second thing that these priests do is that they teach the people that obedience to the rulers and the obedience to the better sort of people is part of the divine commandment. So they teach obedience to the people, as well as sort of they are intermediaries with the divine forces that control nature. So to sum up, the state, you have cities, you have agriculture, and you have the political state and the state religion, whose functions I've outlined. Now, a fourth, and maybe the most important element in civilization, is the existence of a class structure. And this distinguishes these civilized societies. It distinguishes slave society, tributary society, and capitalist society from hunting and gathering societies. Because in civilized societies, there exists a class of landlords who actually own land where all the food comes from. The peasants don't own the land. They basically rent the land, or admitted to the land, by paying the landlord class. Usually this class are also warriors, so watch out, peasant. This landlord class basically collects a rent from the peasantry, off of which it lives. And it's precisely this upper class, this landlord class, that dominates all of these civilizations. And it is from this landlord class that the bureaucrats, the military men, and the priests who dominate the state religion, they're all recruited from this landlord class. So the state arises from the landlord class. Are there any questions about this? Because it might be a little complicated. So there's cities, there's agriculture, there is the state and the state religion, and now I've said there's an upper class, there's a class structure. Most of the people are either peasants, and a few lucky ones become craftsmen in the town, that become a shoemaker. or a furniture maker, if they're lucky. But most of the people are living in the countryside. They're peasants, and they have to pay a tax to the landlord, rent to the landlord. And as a matter of fact, in addition to that, the state also will collect a tax from them as well, in order to run the state. Yes.
So then, where do sort of nomadic cultures that did have?
I can't speak up.
Where do nomadic cultures, like say like the Mongol Empire, they had a state and a ruling class, but they didn't have agriculture. At least they weren't.
You're talking about a specific state?
Like nomadic or pastoral.
I'm just leaving because they're peripheral. I'm not dealing with them right now. Okay. So those are key characteristics of civilization, but we do see where a characteristic of these civilized society is that the state, in order to sort of enhance, it needs these buildings to function, but also in order to enhance its prestige, it will do a lot of monumental building as well. There is monumental government buildings, and especially we have a lot of religious temples. The government buildings, palaces, temples, huge buildings are put up by the ruling class and the ruling elite who run the government as a kind of the centers of government and also spectacle. State spectacles are run, and especially religious spectacles play an important part. So historical, we see that a lot of vestiges of these structures have persisted all over the world. Wherever there's civilization, there are these great buildings and so on, and they are, of course, great achievements in some cases. First of all, the size of these things and the amount of labor that went into them. But sometimes they're very beautiful and so on. And, of course, we see them amongst the Inca, we see them amongst the Aztecs, of course, the Europeans with their churches and palaces. But the Islamic world has its mosques, its great tombs, its palaces, and so on. This exists monumental architecture in all these structures. A final characteristic that we should note is the existence of writing. The existence of writing. Writing comes in with the development of these civilizations. And the first function of writing absolutely is basically keeping government records. They're directly related to keeping government records. That's how writing got started. Subsequently, writing became important to merchants as the merchant class developed in the cities that I've spoken about. They also began to keep their commercial records by writing. And this writing, of course, is very important in terms of reconstructing the history, because we have writings dating way back to the beginning of these civilizations, back in Egypt and Mesopotamia, or even in India, we have in the Indus Valley, for example, or in China. These early writings are key to historians' understanding. So writing is very, very important. And the last characteristic of civilization that I want to mention is the fact that whereas hunting and gathering society, out of which the earliest civilizations emerged out of antiquity, is characterized by a relatively high degree of equality between men and women. Hunting and gathering societies, of course, there is a division of labor, which is not absolute by any means. The men tend to hunt or fish. The women tend to gather or forage. So there is that contrast, but they overlap. And Some women will hunt along with the men or fish and so on as needed, But there is this rough division. And in terms of authority, sometimes women assume leadership roles in hunting and gathering society. And we see even here in Canada, we see that women are elected chiefs in these hunting and gathering societies. It's not uncommon. But with the coming in of civilization, with the coming in of the class system, with the coming in of the inheritance of property, all power passes to the men. These civilizations, until very lately, women were subordinated to men. Women were secondary to men, and it became this patriarchy became a fundamental aspect of these civilized societies. So what we have seen in the last generation, that is to say, the movement toward the liberation of women is, from a historic point of view, is a revolutionary event in human history. So now I want to talk a little bit about this concept civilization, to go back to it, because it has a kind of interesting sort of, in modern times, the interpretation of civilization has been interesting. Now, where did the term civilization develop in the first place? And I do believe that it is a valid term, given the characteristics that I've marked, I've noted. It does mark most of the civilizations that we're dealing with. So it makes a certain amount of sense, in my opinion. However, we have to consider where it comes from. Every word, every concept has a history, and sometimes it's important to understand the history. Well, the term civilization actually dates back to the 18th century. Now, the 18th century was an extremely it was an amazing century. We're talking about the 18th century, essentially in Europe. Something really splendid happened. It's called the European Enlightenment. And this Enlightenment was the dawn of what they called the Age of Reason, and science. In the wake of the discoveries of Isaac Newton, discovered the laws of gravity and so on, this idea that one could understand nature and society even by using reason, by using experience. This idea spread right through the upper reaches of society all across Europe, and especially in France, but also in Scotland. And it was particularly in France and Scotland, that some theorists began to talk about, I've mentioned the 4 modes of production. Well, back then, that is when people began to talk about the various modes of production, and they tried to sort of order them in a historical sequence. The sequence I gave you began to emerge, that is to say, from hunting and gathering to slavery to feudalism to capitalism. And that sequence began to sort of develop in the thinking of these European intellectuals in the 18th century, and also the term civilization. And so one of the categories that thinkers in that 18th century used was civilization. Well, the significance of that from a historical point of view is that they were trying to distinguish between Europe, which they considered civilized. It had these characteristics, but there was something about the European success. We are civilized. We are. There is such a thing as European civilization, and maybe we can talk about, they particularly singled out the Chinese as a very different but an exemplary civilization. There was great admiration in Europe for China, at least in the first part of the 18th century. So they had this concept of civilization, but it was articulated in contrast to those who were savage, those who were barbarians. And this referred to all the people of the global south. Europeans were civilized. The rest of the world, with some exceptions, was barbarous or savage. And of course, it was, in other words, civilization, the term civilization had a sort of ideological meaning in terms of the emergence of European superiority in contrast to the third world, who are now basically more and more coming under European domination. Do you understand this? Is this clear to you, what I'm saying? It's important to notice this, because it fits in, of course, with the development of Eurocentricity, which I made a big theme of. Well, that became the dominant view, and it remained the dominant view right through the 19th and into the 20th century, at least until 1945. This was the European mentality, the North American white mentality. This was their mentality. However, there were some people who objected. There was a guy, and I list him in concepts or keywords. His name was Rousseau, came from Geneva. He was a philosopher in the 18th century, but he was a contrary, this guy. And he said, you may think that civilization is a great thing, but I think that civilization is the source of corruption and, above all, social inequality. Social equality begins with civilization, and it's bad. Before civilization, people were innocent and good, and civilization has corrupted them, and in particular has imposed social inequality on humanity, and people are suffering in civilization. Okay, that's Rousseau's view. And this, while I said that the dominant view was civilization was a good thing, there was a current of thought right through the 19th and into the 20th century that were skeptical. They thought maybe civilization was confining, was imprisoning, and was the source of inequality and so on. And that stream, you find this particularly in anthropological thinking, which develops in the 19th century. The science, the subject of anthropology emerges, and there is a kind of criticism of so-called European civilization that emerges from this, and it has continued into the 20th century. Now, this movement is actually intensified because civilization, as we know, is running into trouble. Increasingly, as the years pass, especially Western civilization, with its obsession with economic growth. Capitalism is based on economic growth and so on. I mean, we're running into some sort of a fundamental impasse. Are we not? What am I talking about? Yes. The environment, the ecological contradiction, the garbage of civilization is destroying us. You know, that's one problem. But of course, there's a whole lot of others attendant on the capitalist world. There is also the problem of terrible social inequality that exists, as you probably know. And we could go on, but I'm saying that the problems are getting worse rather than better. We know that. And these times we're living in, people are uneasy about the future. So this strain of thought criticizing civilization, and the person who embodies that critique best is this guy by the name of David Graeber. And I mentioned him in the key words, David Graeber. He was a professor in England and so on. He wrote a book called The Dawn of History. And I'm using him because he sums up a lot of the critique of civilization. And what Graeber basically says, inherited from a lot of the things, he said that as a matter of fact, if you look at hunting and gathering society, in the first place, generally people sort of have this idea, well, civilization is progress, civilization is food, food is security, and also we've seen, especially Western civilization, development and so on, and all the good things, the goodies, the consumer goods, and so it's a good thing. Plus all the cultural achievements and so on. So Graeber, reflecting this perspective, he says, well, as a matter of fact, hunters and gatherers, according to the evidence, and he bases himself on evidence, he says that, as a matter of fact, you look at the way of life of hunting and gathering people, first of all, most of them had more than enough food. They could supply, they had no problem getting food. And secondly, as a matter of fact, they, whereas we are rushed, we have no time for anything. We're rushed on, and we're forced into this work discipline. Hunting and gathering people had a lot of time on their hands. They had leisure. It only took them a certain part of the day to get their food out of nature. And there was a trade-off. They had enough food, and they had a lot of leisure. So what do you want out of life anyway, is the question. What we have is just we're run off our feet. And so that hunting and gathering society, far from being savage or barbarian, I mean, there are positive attributes to this. Let's reconsider the matter. In other words, it's a great questioning that has sort of developed in this respect. And as he also has things to say about there was a great deal of, well, there was rough equality between men and women, more equality than existed in civilization. There was most of these hunting-gathering cultures have a higher degree of democratic decision-making than is true of, frankly, these civilized societies, including our own. The degree to which people have actual control, the degree to which they are really democratic, can be open to serious question. I'm not talking about Russia here or someplace like that. I'm talking about this place. You know, if you start examining how much real input people have, control over their lives, it's open to question. So the whole question of democracy. And he goes on and on like that. It's a very rich book that it's called The Dawn of History, and you can get it in many of the books. So that's Graeber. So on the one hand, I've articulated this idea of civilization, told you where it came from, and generally people thought and continue to think that it's a good thing, but there are the critics, is what I'm putting. Now, important to this discussion, and this will conclude the discussion, is what Marx had to say about civilization. Well, he and his pal Engels admired hunting and gathering society for its democracy and for its sense of equality. Because they were socialists, they admired the equality and the democracy, for example, amongst the Iroquois. Their case was the Iroquois and so on. But Marx firmly believed that civilization was a good thing. He was in favor of civilization. He believed in civilization. And why did he believe in it? Because he thought that human progress was a good thing, and that the great palaces, the churches, the great monuments, the great works of art, the great works of literature were part of the heritage of humanity, and they were precious things. And therefore, even though most of these things were created by the upper classes who had the leisure to create or to enjoy these achievements of civilization, they were beyond the ken of most of the peasants and the craftsmen and the workers right through the history of civilization down to our own time. They were the achievements of humankind, and they were the common inherit. They should be the common inheritance of all humanity. That was his view. And the second reason he thought that civilization was good was precisely because of the existence of social classes. Now, I told you he's a socialist, yet he said that the existence of the antagonism between the landlord class and the peasants, or the upper class and the lower classes in society, was good because this hostility, this antagonism. Why was there antagonism? Because the peasants produced the food and the landlord simply appropriated it as rent. So there was a kind of antagonistic relationship. Nevertheless, he said that this antagonism, this class conflict, is the motor of history. It's the motor of history. It's the thing that gives the constant sort of tug of war between the upper and the lower classes is what gives civilization its dynamic. Its momentum comes out of the class struggle. And if you look at history, sure enough, it is this class conflict which has basically been that I think, and also wars, have been the dynamic element which has moved history forward. And of course, he was an optimist, and we today might scratch our heads in the face of the calamities that loom ahead. Nevertheless, he thought it would all end well. He thought that the class struggle would lead to huge economic development, scarcity would, the possibility of feeding everybody on earth and giving them a good standard of living, the possibility of that, and the class struggle leading to a socialist form of society, well, it would all end well with democracy and equality. That was his vision. That basically takes care of my discussion on civilization. Now I want to, first of all, talk a little bit about the beginnings of civilization and then get into 1500. We're going to reach 1500 and we're going to start talking about what the setup in 1500. Well, first of all, we know that civilization is very old. The first civilization started in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, in 3500 BC. The first sort of appearance of all of the attributes that I'm talking about occur in modern-day Iraq, around 3500 BC. Then 400 years later, the same thing happens in Egypt. In Egypt, 3100 BC is the beginning of Egyptian civilization. And it's quite remarkable that this happens more or less coincidentally in this way. That happens in China, 2600 BC. The first appearance of civilization in China. Then in India, 2200 BC. So, and finally, in Latin America, between 2000 and 1000 BC. So that over a millennium, or possibly if extended to 2 millennia, 1,000 or 2,000 years, starting in Mesopotamia, we see a succession of civilizations appearing, and so on. Now, in 1500, and this is in 1500, how many civilizations were there in the world? There were 10. Now we're in 1500. Okay? There were 10 civilizations. I'm simply going to list them of course, there was West European civilization. There was what you can call Russian civilization. Russia had already emerged as a state and a society and a kind of religious system in 1500. There was the Islamic civilization. The major state was the Ottoman Empire. There was, east of the Ottoman Empire, there was a country called Persia, present-day Iran. And it had its own distinctive civilization, distinct from the Ottoman. But of course, it was also Islamic. Then down in India, most of the Indian population were Hindus. But there were the upper class, the ruling class, were Muslims. So the Mughals who came down, who conquered India, they were Muslims. The most of the population were Hindu, and basically the ruling class, the Muslim ruling class, sort of dictated and had control over India. So I've listed now 4 civilizations, like Western Europe, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and this is 5 actually, Persia and India. But then moving further eastward, we have China and Japan, also have to be included. And finally, we do see in Africa, whole across, particularly the northern part of Africa, we do have a series of African kingdoms which were that fit the virtually all the categories of civilization that I've talked about. I'm talking about Zimbabwe, Ghana, Ethiopia, Mali. These were veritable civilized kingdoms. So those are the 10 civilizations that I'm referring to in 1500. Now, looking at the world as a whole, we can say that the world's population at that moment, 1500, was 800 million people. Today we have 8 billion people. Back then we had 800 million. In other words, the population between 1500 and today has expanded tenfold, from 800 billion to 8 billion people. And of these 800 million, 2/3, about 500 million, lived in civilized societies, what we call civilized society. The rest lived as pastoralists, that is to say, they kept sheep, goats, cattle, and lived on the periphery of civilizations, or they were hunting and gathering people. So that was the setup. Let's now begin to talk about Western Europe. Finally, we reach Western Europe. So I've sort of concluded my discussion of civilization. First question. Well, where does the term Europe come from? There was a historian in ancient Greece, in 5th century Greece, by the name of Herodotus. He's mentioned in the key words, Herodotus. He's considered the first historian, first person who actually tried to write a history. He basically was writing, well, it was centered on the Greek people, but he did include non-Greek peoples as well. And it's a work of history, but it's filled with anthropology, because he has a lot to say about the strange customs and traditions of not merely the Greeks, but also other peoples as well. So it's a great class. And he does mention the term Europe, but Europe, from his perspective, it's way up somewhere to the west and to the north. and it's mentioned in a very vague way. And it's a land of forests, of a hinterland. It's marginal. The center of the world is Greece and the Near East, the Mediterranean and the Near East. For him, Europe is on the periphery, and I think one has to sort of understand that that's the way Europe began. It was a very peripheral continent. It was a very peripheral area of the world. The main focus was the Mediterranean and the Middle East, India and China. Europe was up there in the periphery. Furthermore, the next point I want to make is that the Europeans themselves, they knew the term Europe from Herodotus and the other classical writers, but they didn't use that term very much at the beginning, say in 1500. That was not the way the Europeans referred to where they lived. They referred to it as the Christian Commonwealth. Europe is the Christian Commonwealth. And why was the Latin term for that was the Respublica Christiana. That means Christian Commonwealth. Respublica Christiana, noted in the concepts, key words. Why did they refer to it as the Christian Commonwealth? Well, because virtually everybody who lived in Europe was, as a matter of fact, they all belonged to the same religion, the Christian religion. And in particular, they were loyal to the Pope in Rome. In other words, virtually everybody was a Roman Catholic back in 1500. And so this had been inherited from the Middle Ages when the church, Christianity, the Roman Catholicism, that was the worldview of virtually everybody in Europe for centuries and centuries, since the fall of the Roman Empire down to 1500. And it continued into the 16th century. Now, there was already a distinction. The elites in Western Europe, when they looked eastward, they saw somewhere in Central Europe, there was a cutoff point, and that cutoff point, if you traveled eastward, you entered the territory, another territory, because we're Roman Catholics, said the we're really Christians, but off to the east, there are all these people, Russians and Bulgarians and Romanians, who practice this strange variant of Christianity, what we call the Greek Orthodox form of Christianity. And a sense of real difference had emerged. Right down somewhere in the Ukraine, split between the Roman Catholic part and the Orthodox part. And lo and behold, look at what we're looking at today. The war, right there, between these two parts. And it is perceived, particularly in a place like the Ukraine, as a kind of a conflict between those people in the East who are of the Orthodox faith and we're Roman Catholic. And of course, the Orthodox at that time, they were loyal to the Orthodox patriarch who lived in Constantinople, down in Constantinople, down in what is now Turkey. They were loyal to him. The Catholics loyal to the Pope. So there was this fundamental divide. And of course, I already said that Russia had crystallized as a state with the Orthodox religion as a state religion at this point. They were building the Kremlin in 1500. The spirals that you see, they're characteristic, and the walls, those were built at the beginning of the 16th century. Now, well, let's look now at Western Europe and what it was all about. Well, as I said, Western Europe still in 1500 is peripheral. It's on the margin of the civilized world. The real center of the civilized world is the Mediterranean, the Middle East, India, China. Those are this is the central area. Europe is still marginal in 1500. If you look at the economy, you look at the geography, if you look at the size of the state, the area of the states, of the Europeans, you see that basically Europe is weak in comparison to the Ottoman Empire and to the Mughal Empire and to China. At this point, certainly it has its resources, don't get me wrong, but Europe is still a marginal and weak area of the world. The Ottoman Empire and the Chinese Empire are far larger than any other European state. The Chinese economy is far larger than any European state economy. And the products that China produces, namely silk and porcelain, and a little bit later tea, or the products that India produces, namely spices and cotton goods, these are the things that the whole world wants. The Europeans don't produce anything that the rest of the world wants. The whole shebang gets started, that is to say, the sort of birth of the world economy is when the Europeans discover gold and silver in huge quantities in Latin America, down in out in Mexico and down in Bolivia at the beginning of the 16th century. And it's at that point that the Chinese and the Indians basically say, we're prepared to do business with the Europeans. We want gold and silver. And finally, the Europeans have something that they can trade. Up to this point, with the single exception of guns and cannon produced in Germany. That was a commodity that the Asians were interested in. But aside from that, it was only with the discovery of the riches of gold and silver in the Americas, that the Europeans had finally something to trade with the Indians and the Chinese. And the world economy was really born at this point. And of course, it was made possible by the fact that simultaneously the Europeans had invented these ocean-going sailing vessels, which made communication by sea possible. And at this point, it's a real quantitative change. Within Europe, there's the birth of capitalism within, and suddenly this outburst of overseas trade, with the vanguard being these Europeans manning these sailing vessels, and suddenly gold and silver are being exchanged for the spices, the silks, the porcelains, the tea from the East, and a world economy and a new world is being created as a result. Well, we'll pick this up in the next class.
Okay.